The morning Seraphina Calloway disappeared, Dante Moretti was standing in his penthouse kitchen making her coffee. That detail haunted him more than any other. Not the empty closet, not the absence of her shoes by the door, not even the silence that hit him the moment he walked back into the bedroom and understood, with a certainty that needed no explanation, that she was gone. What haunted him, what would continue to haunt him for 3 long years, was that the coffee had still been warm when he realized she wasn't coming back to drink it. That was how close he had been. That was how thin the margin was between having everything and having nothing at all. He had stood there with that mug in his hand for a very long time. Dante Moretti was not a man who stood still. He was not a man who was given to sentiment or paralysis, or the kind of quiet devastation that ordinary people called heartbreak. He had been raised inside the Moretti empire from the moment he was old enough to understand what the Moretti name meant. Raised by a father who believed that a man's value was measured in what he was willing to sacrifice, and a world that tested that belief every single day. By the time Dante was 25, he had already done things that most men would spend a lifetime trying to forget. By 30, he had consolidated the most powerful crime network on the eastern seaboard, outlasted 4 rival families, and buried 2 enemies who had made the fatal error of underestimating him. He had built something enormous and cold and indestructible. And then he had met Seraphina Calloway at a charity gala he had attended purely for appearances. Watched her read his lips from across the room when he made an offhand comment to Marco, and felt the entire architecture of everything he thought he was shift 6 inches to the left. She had been sitting at a corner table with a glass of white wine she wasn't drinking, wearing a dark green dress, watching the room with the calm and particular attention of someone who had learned to read the world through its surfaces rather than its sounds. She was deaf, had been since 19, when a sudden and aggressive illness had stolen her hearing in the span of 2 weeks, leaving her in a silence that the world never stopped treating as a disadvantage. What the world missed, and what Dante understood within 20 minutes of sitting beside her, what was that Seraphina Calloway had developed a quality of perception that most hearing people would never possess. She saw things. She read rooms and faces and the small dishonest movements of people who thought their words were enough to cover them. She could not be lied to easily. She could not be managed or manipulated with the usual tools of charm and misdirection, because she was always watching the thing beneath the thing. Dante had found that extraordinary. He found her extraordinary. And for the first time in his adult life, he had pursued someone not for strategy, not for alliance, not for any reason that could be written down in the ledger of calculated decisions that governed his every other relationship, but simply because she made the world feel like it had more dimensions than he had previously been willing to admit. They had been together for 14 months. 14 months during which Dante had, quietly and without announcement, begun structuring small parts of his life around her presence. He had learned ASL, American Sign Language, not because she asked him to, but because he refused to let any part of their conversation be lost to an interpreter or a notepad. He learned it the same way he learned everything, with absolute dedication and the stubborn refusal to do anything halfway. He was imperfect at it. She had laughed at his early attempts, a full and unguarded laugh that he replayed in his memory more times than he would ever admit. But he had become fluent enough to say the things that mattered, fluent enough to make sure she always knew she was included. And then one morning, she was gone, and the coffee was still warm. And Dante Moretti stood in his penthouse like a man who had just realized he was holding a handful of sand that had already fallen through his fingers. He searched for her. Of course he searched for her. He deployed every resource the Moretti network possessed, every contact, every favor, every intelligence channel that had been built over 2 generations of empire building. He had people searching in 17 cities within a week. He had financial analysts tracking card activity, logistics people monitoring travel records, and 3 separate private investigators working independent threads. He found nothing. Seraphina had vanished with an efficiency that suggested she had planned it carefully, which told him something he didn't want to know about how long she had been preparing to leave. What he didn't know what nobody told him for 8 months, was why. For 8 months, Dante operated on the assumption that he had done something, that there had been a conversation he had misread, a moment he had mishandled, some version of himself that she had finally seen clearly enough to walk away from. He reconstructed their last days together with obsessive precision, replaying every exchange, searching for the fault line. He found candidates, moments where his world had pressed too close, where the violence that lived at the edges of his life had cast shadows she must have felt, but nothing that explained the completeness of her disappearance, nothing that explained why she had not said a single word. Then Piero Greco had called. Dr. Piero Greco was Seraphina's physician, a quiet, careful man who had been her primary doctor since she lost her hearing, who understood the specific vulnerabilities of her world and had become, over time, something between a medical advisor and a trusted friend. He had known about Dante. He had met Dante twice, briefly, and formed the opinion that Dante was not a safe man, but that he appeared to genuinely love Seraphina, which in Piero's measured assessment made the situation complicated rather than simple. 8 months after Seraphina disappeared, Piero called Dante's private line. He did not reveal her location. He didn't know it at that point. But he told Dante what had happened the night she left. He told Dante about the lower hall and the cracked door and what Seraphina had seen. Dante had been silent on the phone for so long that Piero had asked if he was still there. No, he was still there. He was sitting very still in his office with his eyes fixed on the photograph he kept on the corner of his desk, a photograph of Seraphina taken on a Tuesday afternoon in his kitchen, laughing at something just outside the frame, her hair loose, wearing one of his shirts that was too large for her, looking exactly like a person who had no idea she was being photographed and no idea how extraordinary she looked just being herself in an ordinary moment. He kept that photograph on his desk for the next 3 years, not as a shrine, not as sentiment, as a reminder, as the single fixed point around which everything else in his life continued to orbit without quite touching the center of anything that mattered. 3 years later, Porto Sereno was exactly what the name promised. A quiet, sun-bleached coastal town with whitewashed buildings and a harbor full of fishing boats and a pace of life that moved like the tide, slow, reliable, and indifferent to urgency. It was not a place where powerful men came looking for people. It was a place where people went to stop being found. Seraphina had chosen it carefully. She had chosen everything about her new life carefully. The name Sera Callow, simple and unremarkable. The apartment above a small ceramics shop on a street 2 blocks from the water. The routine of early mornings and the smell of clay and glaze and sea air. The community of local artists and shop owners who asked her politely about her deafness once, accepted her matter-of-fact explanation, and never made it strange again. She had chosen Porto Sereno the way a person chooses a wound dressing, something that covers the damage, allows healing, and does not draw attention to the injury beneath. She was good here. That was the honest truth, and she had made her peace with it. She made ceramics that sold steadily to tourists and collectors. She had a small circle of people she liked. She had mornings that began without fear and evenings that ended without listening for footsteps in the corridor. She had, 3 years into this life, begun to believe that the past was genuinely behind her, not forgotten because she was not naive enough to confuse forgetting with healing, but behind her, filed away, survived. She was in the back of her shop, centered over a wheel, hands deep in the wet resistance of fresh clay, when she felt the particular quality of stillness that always told her someone had entered the space. She felt it through the floor, the slight vibration of footsteps, and through some other sense she had developed in the years since losing her hearing, a sensitivity to the way the air in a room changed when it was no longer empty. She turned, expecting Mira from the cafe next door or one of her regular customers. Dante Moretti was standing in the doorway of her shop. He was wearing a charcoal coat. His hair was slightly longer than she remembered. There were new lines at the corners of his eyes, faint but present. He looked like a man who had not slept well in a very long time. He looked like a man who had walked through 3 years of damage and come out the other side intact through sheer force of will, which was, she realized in the space of 1 breathless second, exactly what he was. The clay bowl she had been shaping went lopsided. She felt it lose form under her hands, but she could not look away from him. He was looking at her the way she had seen him look at very few things in the world, with the total and undivided attention of someone who is not performing composure, but genuinely possessing it, even as everything underneath it is in motion. He was not angry or cold, or wearing the hard expression she had half expected. He looked like a man who had traveled a very long distance to arrive at a place he had been afraid might not exist. He stepped inside. He moved slowly, deliberately, the way a person moves when they are making a point of not being threatening. He stopped 6 feet away, and then he raised his right hand, and in ASL, clear and steady, each motion deliberate, he signed her name. Not Sera, not the name on the shop, not the name on her lease. Sera. She stood up from the wheel so fast the stool scraped back. She was on her feet with her hands raised and her body already angled toward the rear door before she processed the fact that she had moved. Her heart was hitting the inside of her ribs in a rhythm she felt in her teeth. 3 years of carefully constructed calm collapsed in approximately 4 seconds. She did not run. She was not a woman who ran without information. She had run once without information and spent 3 years in the aftermath of that decision. So she stood where she was, clay-covered hands still raised, and looked at him. He did not move to block her. He did not reach for her or raise his voice or deploy any of the tools of intimidation that he possessed in abundance. He just stood there and let her see him. Let her read his face, which had always been one of the things she could do with him that she could not do with most people. Most people performed their faces. Dante, in the years she had known him, had a face that was simply true. She had never been able to decide if that was because he trusted her or because he was too self-possessed to bother with pretense. Perhaps both. He said something. She read his lips. "I'm not here to hurt you. I need you to know that. But I'm also not leaving without answers." She looked past him at the shop entrance. Marco Vitale was standing just outside the door, his hands folded in front of him, watching the street with the practiced vacancy of a man who is paid to wait. 2 more men stood further back, positioned with the kind of casual precision that was never actually casual. She looked back at Dante. Her hands moved. "How did you find me?" He reached into his coat pocket and produced a photograph. She recognized it immediately. It had been taken in this shop 6 months ago through the front window. She was at the wheel, her hair pinned up, entirely unaware of the camera. She looked at the photograph and then she looked at him, and the full weight of what this meant settled into her chest like ballast. He said, "A man passing through on other business. He recognized your face. He knew I'd been looking." "For how long?" she signed. 3 years, he said. Without stopping, she stood in the middle of her workshop with clay drying on her hands, and the ghost of the life she had built vibrating around her like something fragile that hadn't yet registered the impact. And she looked at Dante Moretti and felt every single thing she had been not feeling for 3 years come awake in her chest like a tide she had mistakenly believed was controlled. She did not let him see it. She was very good at not letting people see it. She signed, "What do you want?" He looked at her for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, it was slowly and clearly, so that she caught every word. "The truth. That's all. I want to know the truth, and then I want you to hear the truth. And then—" He paused, and something moved through his expression that she had no name for. "We'll decide what comes next." She did not answer. She put down the lopsided bowl she had somehow still been holding, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked to the sink in the corner of the workshop. She washed her hands with slow deliberateness, and when she turned back around, Dante was still standing exactly where she had left him, patient in the way that only very powerful or very determined men could be patient, which was to say, not at all passively, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already decided how this was going to end. She dried her hands. She looked at him. She signed, "I'm closing the shop." He nodded once, stepped back toward the door, paused, and said, "I'll be on the front step, with coffee. if that still means anything. She turned away before he could see her expression change. But her hands, are pressed flat against the counter where he couldn't see them, were trembling. She told herself it was anger. It might have been something much older and more complicated than anger. She was not ready to look at it directly yet. Behind her, the door of the shop opened and closed, and Dante Moretti went to wait on her front step. The same patient, absolute certainty in his posture that had always made her feel, even when it terrified her, like the most seen person in any room. Porto Sereno went on around her in its slow and indifferent way. Boats in the harbor, light on the water, a town that had nothing to do with Moretti empires or the cost of loving dangerous people. And somewhere inside Seraphina Calloway, a door she had locked from the inside 3 years ago clicked, very quietly, ajar. There is a particular kind of courage required to sit down across from the truth you have been running from. Not the courage of combat or crisis, which arrives fast and chemical and is over before you've had time to be afraid, but the slower, quieter courage of choosing to remain in a room where something real is about to be said, when every instinct you possess is screaming that the door is right there, and 3 years of practice have made you very good at walking through it. Seraphina Calloway had that kind of courage. She had always had it. It was the same courage that had carried her through losing her hearing at 19, through learning to navigate a world that was not built for her silence, through 14 months of loving a man she knew was dangerous, and choosing to love him anyway because there was a version of him that she believed in even when it frightened her. She had that courage in abundance. What she had not had, 3 years ago, was enough information to do anything with it. She set the terms of the meeting herself, her space, her table, her rules. Dante came in the morning with Marco waiting outside, his phone placed face up on the table between them at her silent request. No calls, no interruptions, no communication running in parallel to the one happening in this room. It was a gesture of deference that she noted without comment, and filed alongside other things she was not yet ready to address. She sat across from him with her hands folded on the table and waited. He did not perform discomfort. Why, he did not attempt to manage the atmosphere with small talk or charm. He simply looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention and waited for her to begin, because he understood, as he had always understood, that this was going to happen on her timeline or not at all. She signed, "I saw you in the lower hall, the night before I left. I saw what you did, Dante. I saw all of it." He held her gaze. He did not look away, did not shift, did not produce any of the small involuntary movements that accompany a lie finding its shape. He simply absorbed what she said, and then he nodded. A single, slow nod that confirmed what she had just told him rather than disputing it. He said, "I know. Piero told me. 8 months after you left." The mention of Piero landed like cold water. She sat with it, working through the implications, and then signed, "Piero contacted you?" "He called my private line," Dante said. "He didn't know where you were. He said he didn't. But he wanted me to know why you had gone. He said—" He paused, chose his words carefully. "He said he thought I was destroying myself trying to find a reason that didn't involve you simply choosing to leave, and that I deserved to know the truth of it, even if he couldn't give me more than that." Something shifted in Seraphina's expression. It was not softening exactly. It was recalibration, the look of a person revising a map they have been navigating by. She had trusted Piero completely. She had trusted that the shape of her disappearance was exactly what she had constructed it to be. Clean, sealed, unknowable. The knowledge that Piero had opened one edge of it, even without revealing her location, even with the best intentions, landed with a particular sharpness because she understood that intentions were not the same as outcomes, and that the story she had been living for 3 years had been operating with at least one variable she hadn't known about. She said nothing for a moment. Then she signed. "What did you do with that information?" "I stopped looking for reasons," he said. "And I started looking for you harder, because at least then I understood what I was looking for." She looked at the table. She looked at the window. She looked at the space between her hands and made a decision. "Tell me about the man in the lower hall," she signed. "Tell me who he was. Tell me everything." And Dante told her. The man's name was Cesare Aldo, a mid-level operative from the Renzi network, Victor Renzi's predecessor organization, who had spent 8 months embedded near the edges of Dante's world gathering information and biding his time. 3 months before Seraphina disappeared, Cesare Aldo had organized an operation with one specific target. Not Dante, not any Moretti asset, but Seraphina herself. The logic was as old as empire. To remove the thing that makes a powerful man human is to remove the guardrail on his judgment. To take what he loves is to leave him reckless. The operation had been intercepted. Dante had learned of it through his intelligence network 48 hours before it was scheduled to execute, and he had handled it the way he handled every existential threat to something he valued, decisively, personally, and without leaving anything that could come back. Seraphina had never been told, because telling her would have meant exposing the degree of danger her presence in his life created, and some part of him had made the catastrophically wrong decision that protecting her from that knowledge was preferable to the alternative. He told her all of this without deflection and without self-justification. He laid it out like a document, factual, complete, and unflattering in the places where it needed to be unflattering. When he finished, Seraphina was quiet for a long time. Her hands were still on the table. She was looking at a point just past his shoulder, processing, and he let her process because he had always known when to give her room, and this was absolutely one of those times. She finally looked at him and signed, "You made a decision about what I could handle without asking me, a decision that changed the entire shape of my life, and you think the reason you made it justifies the way you made it. It was not a question, it was an observation, precise and without excess anger. The observation of a woman who has spent 3 years understanding something from one angle and is now seeing it from another, and has the self-possession to hold both angles at the same time without collapsing them into a simple story." "No," he said. "I don't think it justifies it. I think it was a mistake. I think I chose what was easier for me over what was honest with you, and I told myself it was protection. Those aren't the same thing. I know that now." She looked at him steadily. "Do you know it because I left?" she signed. "Or do you know it because it's actually true?" "Both," he said. That's the honest answer. And it was such a Dante Moretti answer, stripped of performance without the softening gloss that most people would have applied, that despite everything, despite 3 years, and the trembling in her hands and the map she was still revising, something in her chest released a tension it had been holding for a very long time. She did not smile, but her hands came unfolded on the table, and she sat back in her chair, and the quality of her stillness changed from fortification to something slightly more open. The confrontation might have ended there, in that slowly clearing space of 2 people who had stopped talking past each other and started talking through. Except that Victor Renzi arrived in Porto Sereno that afternoon. Seraphina was at the market 2 streets from her shop when she became aware of a man she did not recognize watching her with the particular quality of attention that had nothing to do with curiosity and everything to do with assessment. He was tall and well-dressed, and wore his danger the way expensive men sometimes wear expensive things, casually, as if it cost him nothing, as if you were expected to be grateful for the proximity to it. He introduced himself before she could move away, stepping into her sight line with deliberate courtesy, extending a hand and giving her a name that she clocked immediately, Victor Renzi. She had heard Dante mention that name once, in a conversation she had not been supposed to hear in the early days of their relationship, when the shape of his world was still becoming clear to her. She had filed it under things she was not yet ready to fully look at. She had not expected it to walk up to her in a market in Porto Sereno and introduce itself by name. She was reading his lips, watching the performance of charm he was deploying, understanding with the bone-deep clarity of someone who cannot rely on tone of voice that the warmth he was performing was not touching his eyes when Dante appeared at her side. He had not run. He moved at the pace of a man who knows that running changes the nature of a situation, and he has decided what nature this situation is going to have. He positioned himself next to Seraphina, not in front of her, not blocking her or removing her from the scene, but beside her, on a presence rather than a wall, and looked at Victor with an expression that contained no aggression and required none because the message was already complete. Victor smiled, unhurried, said something to Dante that Seraphina caught only half of. Dante answered in a single sentence. Victor held his gaze for a moment, then looked at Seraphina with an expression that was a message in itself, a reminder that he had seen her now, that she was noted, that this encounter had accomplished what it came here to accomplish. And then he walked away. The moment he was gone, Seraphina turned to Dante. "He followed you here." "Yes." "He came here specifically to see that you had found me." "Yes." She signed, sharp and direct. "Is this what my life would be? People like him? Dangers I cannot hear coming? Threats that exist because of what I mean to you and that I have no ability to protect myself against?" She watched Dante's face absorb this, and she watched something happen behind his eyes that she had only seen once or twice in the 14 months they had spent together. A fracture, small and deep, in the composure that he wore like a second skin. He looked at her with an expression that was not carefully managed, but simply true, the way his face had always been true with her, and she saw in it the full weight of what he was about to say. "Yes," he said. "Yes, that is what your life would be. I won't lie to you about that because I have already lied to you about it in the one way that mattered, and I know what that cost both of us. The danger is real, and it is connected to me, and no amount of love or resources or determination on my part makes it disappear. That is the truth." She waited. She could see there was more. "What I can tell you," he continued, "is that for the last 3 years, the danger you faced by being away from me was just as real as the danger you faced by being with me. The only difference is that away from me you faced it alone. With me—" He stopped, steadied himself. "With me, you would never face anything alone. I can promise you that with more certainty than I can promise you anything else in this world." She walked away from him that evening. He let her go, and she marked that. The fact that he let her go, that he did not deploy Marco, or close any road, or use any of the considerable resources at his disposal to prevent her from putting physical distance between herself and the conversation they had just had. She walked to the harbor and stood at the edge of the water for a long time. The sea moved in and out with its old indifference, and she stood in the silence that was always with her and thought about a man who had made a catastrophic mistake and spent 3 years paying for it, and had, when given the chance to diminish or deflect or construct a more flattering version of events, simply chosen the truth. She was still standing there when Marco appeared beside her, and she saw immediately from his expression that something had happened. Victor Renzi's men had made a move on her apartment while she was at the harbor. 2 men, a swift and professional, evidently planning to use her as leverage in whatever conversation Victor intended to have with Dante from a position of strength. They had been intercepted outside her building by Dante's people before they reached her door. There had been a confrontation. It had been resolved. Marco drove her to the hotel. She walked into Dante's room to find him sitting at the table with a fresh bandage on his forearm, his jacket gone, 3 of his men standing at various points around the room with the alert stillness of people who have recently been in motion and have not yet fully stood down. He looked up when she came in. He said nothing. He did not launch into explanation or reassurance or strategy. He just looked at her with that same direct, unhurried attention and let her look at him, and let her see the bandage, and let her process what it meant. She walked across the room and sat down across from him. She looked at his arm. She looked at his face. And then, without quite deciding to, she reached across the table and took his bandaged hand in both of hers. Neither of them signed. Neither of them spoke. The men in the room quietly redistributed themselves, and somewhere in the building Marco Vitale made calls in his low and efficient voice, and Porto Sereno moved through its quiet night outside the window. Seraphina sat in the lamp-lit room with Dante's hand between her palms and felt the slow, seismic truth of the moment settling into her body like something she had been carrying for a very long time, finally being set down. She was not ready to call it forgiveness. She was not ready to call it anything. But she stayed. And the staying was everything. Love, the second time, does not feel like the first. The first time, love arrives like weather, sudden and total, filling the sky before you've had time to look up and understand what's coming. It is glorious and disorienting, and you live inside it the way you live inside a storm, entirely, with no perspective, certain that this particular sky has always been exactly this color and could not possibly be any other. The second time, the time after separation and damage and the slow, grinding work of choosing to return to something that broke you open. Love does not arrive like weather. It arrives like a tide. It comes in gradually, measurably, and each advance gives you enough time to decide whether you're going to stand your ground or move back, and you keep standing your ground. And one day you look down and the water is at your ankles and then your waist, and somewhere in the process of making 1,000 small daily decisions to stay, you understand that you have chosen this. Not been overtaken by it, not swept away by it, chosen it deliberately with full knowledge of what it costs. This is the love that Seraphina and Dante built in the weeks after Porto Sereno became the site of their reckoning. Dante did not return to the Moretti estate. He did not summon Seraphina to his world, or suggest that the natural resolution of everything that had happened was her folding back into the life she had left. He stayed in Porto Sereno. He rented a house 2 streets from her shop, a modest house by any Moretti standard, with a small walled garden and windows that faced the water, and he moved into it with the matter-of-fact simplicity of a man who has decided where he needs to be and is not interested in making a production of the decision. Marco ran the Moretti operations from the city with Dante available by phone for anything critical. The day-to-day machinery of the empire continued to function because it had been built to function, and because Marco Vitale was extraordinarily competent and had been waiting, in his patient and devoted way, for Dante to put something above the empire for a very long time. Dante showed up at Sera's shop the first morning carrying 2 coffees, the same gesture that had opened their second day, which had itself echoed the 14 months that preceded the disappearance, and she let him sit on the front step. She did not invite him inside. She sat beside him, took 1 coffee, and they drank in silence with the morning light coming off the harbor 2 streets away, and it was the most ordinary and improbable thing in the world. It became a routine. Not quickly. Nothing between them moved quickly now, because they were both people who had learned what rushed foundations cost, but incrementally, the way mornings become routines before you've consciously chosen them. Coffee on the step, then, eventually, coffee inside at the small table near the window. He learned the names of her pieces. She had a whole series she called the Tidal Collection, forms that looked like water caught mid-motion, glazed in grays and blues, and the pale green of sea glass, and asked about them with genuine interest, the way he had always listened to her, not with all of himself and none of the distracted half-attention that most people offered. She noticed that he always positioned himself so that she could see his face. Always. It was never an accident. When other people entered the shop and conversations happened around her, Dante's attention moved between the conversation and her, not to translate, not to speak for her, but to ensure that she was never excluded, never on the outside of what was happening, never left to piece together a conversation from half a view. He had done this in their first relationship too, but she had not fully understood at the time what it meant, the sustained, daily attention it required to think about someone's experience of a room before your own. She understood it better now. Elaine arrived on a Tuesday. Elaine Calloway was 3 years older than Seraphina and approximately 300% more willing to say out loud the uncomfortable thing that everyone in the room was thinking. She had been the architect of Sera's disappearance, the one who had found Porto Sereno, who had established the new identity, who had driven her sister to the bus station at 4 a.m. and held her face in both hands and said, "You do not owe anyone an explanation for choosing your own survival." She had meant every word. She still meant every word. She walked into Sera's shop on a Tuesday morning, looked at Dante Moretti standing at the back counter drinking coffee and discussing the Tidal Collection, with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm, and her expression went through approximately 5 distinct phases in the span of 4 seconds. Dante turned when he felt the change in the room and looked at Elaine with the same composure he brought to every situation that required it. Elaine said several things, directly and without preamble, as was her nature. She covered the 3 years of watching her sister rebuild herself from the ground up. She covered the night she had received a trembling phone call from a girl who had witnessed something she should never have had to witness. She covered her opinion of men who build empires on violence and then wonder why the people who love them eventually run. She was not wrong about any of it. She was not even particularly unkind in her delivery. She was simply unwilling to perform a graciousness she did not feel. Dante listened. He stood with his coffee and he listened to every word. And when she finished, he did not argue, did not justify, did not produce the arsenal of counter-arguments available to him. He said, "You're right about most of that. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let your sister make her own choice about her own life. You've been protecting her for 3 years and you did it well. But she doesn't need a closed door. She needs an open one." Elaine looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at Sera. Then she took the 3rd coffee that was sitting on the counter. Dante had apparently anticipated her arrival, which she found profoundly irritating, and sat down. She didn't leave Porto Sereno. She rented a room at the small inn near the harbor and stayed, watching with the careful attention of a woman who loves someone too much to look away. And over the weeks that followed, she watched something happen that she had not entirely expected. She watched her sister come back to herself in a way that was different from the coming back she had done in Porto Sereno alone. Not because Dante was the reason for Sera's wholeness. Sera had built her wholeness herself in 3 years of deliberate and solitary work, but because there is a particular kind of becoming yourself that only happens in the presence of the person who sees you most clearly, and Seraphina and Dante, whatever else they were to each other, had always had that. Elaine did not lower her guard, but she adjusted its angle. Victor Renzi was handled at a distance, a coordinated Moretti action that Marco managed with the cold efficiency that had made him indispensable, dismantling the leverage Victor had built and removing him from the board without any of it touching Porto Sereno. Sera learned the broad outlines afterward and asked Dante 3 direct questions about it, and he answered all 3 without evasion. She noted the answers. She noted that he had answered. Piero Greco came on a Friday. He came quietly on his own and found Sera in her workshop before the shop opened. She saw him in the doorway, and they looked at each other for a moment. 2 people who had loved the same woman and both, in their own way, made decisions about her life that they had not been entitled to make. She crossed the workshop and hugged him. He held on with the slightly too tight grip of a man who had spent months not being sure he would ever see her again. When she pulled back, she looked at his face and read the weight of everything he had been carrying, and she signed, "I'm not entirely not angry at you." He said aloud, with a watery kind of steadiness, "I know. I stand by the decision and I'm sorry for how it landed." She signed, "That is the most Piero Greco answer imaginable." He almost smiled. She did smile. And the thing between them, which had been fragile and uncertain since Marco had explained the phone call, began to knit itself back into the shape of what it had always been. There was an evening in the 4th week when everything shifted, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but with the quiet finality of a tide reaching its mark. They were on the waterfront after the shop had closed, and sitting on the low wall above the harbor with the dark water below them, and the town lit up at their backs. Sera had been telling him about the 3 years, not the practical facts, which he knew, but the inside of them. What it had felt like to be in a new place, with a new name, and the old grief sitting in the corner of every room. What it had felt like to be surrounded by silence that was, for the first few months, completely full of him. He listened with his whole body, in the particular way he had of listening that made you feel the weight of your own words, the fact that they were landing somewhere real. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he raised his hands and signed, slowly, imperfectly, signed with the same earnest effort he had brought to learning ASL in the first place. I kept your photograph on my desk every single day, not to find you, just to remember what it felt like to be a person who had something worth protecting. She looked at his hands. She looked at his face. 3 years of accumulated survival and grief and reconstruction sat between them in the salt air, and she felt it, not as weight, but as substance, as the real material of something that had been tested and had not dissolved. She reached over and took his hand, not urgently, just took it, the way you take hold of something you've decided to keep. I have terms, she signed with her free hand. Name them, he said immediately. No hesitation, no negotiation. She named them. Porto Sereno stays. Her work stays. Every decision about the shape of their life together goes through both of them. He is honest with her, not about every operational detail of his world which she does not require, but about anything that touches her safety, or her choices, or the things she has the right to know. He does not decide what she can handle. She decides what she can handle. He agreed to every term, not with the easy agreement of a man promising things he hasn't thought through, but with the specific, deliberate agreement of a man who has spent 3 years understanding exactly what he is being asked for and why, and finds the terms not only fair but correct. The proposal, when it came, was entirely like him. He came into the shop on a Wednesday afternoon when she was between pieces, wiping her hands on her apron, and he placed a small box on the counter between 2 of her finished mugs. He did not kneel. He did not speechify. He stood across the counter with his hands in his coat pockets and watched her face as she opened it. Inside was a ring. Not the most extravagant thing Moretti wealth could have produced. Not the diamond edifice that would have announced itself before she had even seen it. It was a warm, slim band set with a single stone the color of sea glass, the pale, particular green of her tidal collection, the color of water caught in shallow light. She understood immediately that he had chosen it with the same attention to detail that he brought to everything that mattered to him, which was to say with the totality of himself applied in a direction she had set. She looked at the ring for a long time. She looked at him, and then she picked it up and slid it onto her finger herself and looked at him over the counter and signed, "My terms," he said, "always." And he smiled, a real one, the kind that came from somewhere below performance. And she held the shape of it in her mind like a ceramic form she intended to keep. The wedding was held on the waterfront in Porto Sereno on a clear September morning when the light came sideways off the water and made everything the color of something just beginning. It was small. For a Moretti event, it was barely a gathering. 40 people. No marble halls, no cathedral, no display of empire. A white cloth and flowers on a long table, and the sea behind them, and the people who had been present for the actual story rather than the version of it that would be told later. Elaine stood for Sera, knew having progressed from watchful disapproval through grudging acknowledgement to the particular brand of gruff, unsentimental affection that was the deepest form of Elaine Calloway's regard. She fixed Sera's hair with the focused attention of a woman who will not let anyone see her cry, and then immediately cried. Marco stood for Dante, as he had stood for him in every significant moment of the last 12 years, with the absolute and uncomplicated loyalty of a man who has chosen his person and will not be moved. Piero sat in the front row and folded his hands in his lap and looked like a man who had made at least one genuinely difficult decision in his life and was, on balance, glad of how it had turned out. The vows were said in 2 languages, spoken and signed, and when Dante signed his vows imperfectly and earnestly, every stumbled motion of his hands carrying the full weight of 3 years of intention, there was not a person present who did not understand what they were witnessing, not a performance of love, not a ceremony of ownership or alliance or the consolidation of any kind of power. Just a man standing in front of the woman who had undone him and put him back together differently, saying the truest things he knew how to say in the language she lived in. She signed hers back without looking away from him, clear and steady, deliberate. This is my choice, made with full information, made freely. You are what I choose. In the months that followed, Dante did not dissolve his empire. Seraphina had not asked him to, and she had not asked him to because she understood, with the clear-eyed realism that had always been one of her most essential qualities, that asking someone to stop being who they are is not love, but renovation, and renovation is not the same as acceptance. She had accepted him, completely, without pretense, with full knowledge of the ledger. But he restructured. He pulled back from the most exposed and violent operations, built legitimate architecture over the foundations of the Moretti name for the first time in 2 generations, and moved the center of gravity of his life from the Moretti estate to a house in Porto Sereno with a walled garden and windows that faced the water. It was not a fairy tale transformation. He would be the first to say so, and she would agree. But it was a real one, incremental, honest, ongoing. She kept her shop. She kept her title collection and the morning wheel and the quiet that was not emptiness, but fullness, a silence she had made her own and would not exchange for the noisiest version of any other life. On a Tuesday evening, several months after the wedding, Dante came into the workshop as the light was going golden and the day was folding into dusk. Sera was at the wheel, centered and focused, her hands moving through the particular disciplined meditation of someone who is most themselves when they are making something. She felt his footsteps and looked up. He had rolled up his sleeves. He looked at the second wheel she had set up against the opposite wall, the wheel she had added 2 weeks before, without comment, as a simple and total statement of fact, and he sat down at it. He had no idea what he was doing. This was immediately apparent. The clay went lopsided within 30 seconds, listing to one side with the cheerful indifference of material that is not being managed by anyone who knows what they're doing. Seraphina watched this unfold. She watched the most controlled and precise man she had ever known sit in increasingly consternated concentration as the clay declined to cooperate with him. And she felt something move through her chest. Not the tidal love, not the serious and chosen love, but the lighter, older thing beneath it. The thing that had existed since a corner table at a charity gala when he had made an offhand comment to Marco, and she had read his lips from across the room and felt, for no reason she could immediately identify, the particular pull of a person she was going to need to know. And she was smiling before she'd fully decided to. She stood up, crossed the workshop, and sat down beside him at his wheel. She reached over and covered his hands with hers, adjusting, correcting, guiding the clay back toward center. He let her. Of course he let her. And in the warm, clay-scented air of the workshop, with the harbor light coming through the window and the sound of water somewhere beyond the wall and the particular silence that had always been full of everything that mattered, Seraphina Calloway and Dante Moretti centered something together. Not perfectly, not on the first try, but with the patience and intention of 2 people who had learned, the long and costly way, that the only things worth keeping are the things you choose to come back to. If you made it to the end of Silent Vows, then somewhere in this story, in Sera's quiet courage, in Dante's 3 years of holding on, in the slow and deliberate way they chose each other the second time, something spoke to you. Stories like this one don't just entertain. They remind us what we're capable of, choosing truth over comfort, staying when it costs something, and building something real from the wreckage of what almost wasn't. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves a love story that earns its ending. Comment below. Were you Team Sera from the beginning, or did Dante win you over? At what moment did you know they were going to find their way back? Subscribe/follow so you never miss the next story, because the next one is already coming, and it is going to hit just as hard. And if you've been the one who ran, or the one left holding the coffee, know that some stories don't end where they pause. Sometimes the tide just needed time. Silent vows. Because real love doesn't disappear. It just waits until both people are ready to be honest.